All right, Cole, you are ready to go.
Sweet. All righty. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jim Beasley. Jim Beasley is an associate professor at the Savannah River Ecology Lab in Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. Jim earned a bachelor's from SUNY ESF and a master's and PhD in wildlife ecology from Purdue University. His professional interests include the spatial ecology and population dynamics of wildlife, management of wild pigs, carnivore ecology, human-wildlife interactions, and scavenging ecology. He's actively involved in research on these topics, both nationally and internationally, including studies on large mammal populations in Chernobyl and Fukushima, some of which we will hear about tomorrow. Since 2007, Jim has published over 130 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters on these topics, as well as 2 books, Ecology and Management of Terrestrial Invasive Species in the United States and Invasive Wild Pigs in North America, Ecology, Impacts, and Management. His research has also been featured by several dozen international media organizations, including the New York Times, Animal Planet, NPR, CNN, BBC, National Geographic, Nature, and other major media outlets. Since 2014, Jim has served as the International Atomic Energy Agency's wildlife advisor to the Fukushima Prefecture in Japan in response to the 2011 nuclear accident, and in this role routinely travels to Japan to assist with the monitoring and recovery efforts of that region. Dr. Beasley and I overlapped for a short period at Purdue, and that time had quite an impact on me and my career path. I've enjoyed following along with his work since our time at Purdue and thrilled he accepted the invite to come speak to us. So with that, Dr. Beasley, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, cool. Thanks for that great introduction. Can you all see my screen? Good. Okay. So thanks, Cole, for that introduction. I was looking forward to coming out to Utah, maybe doing a little skiing this time of year, but this is the next best thing. So I really appreciate you all taking some time out of your busy days to listen to my talk here today. Today, my talk's going to be a little different than my talk tomorrow. Today, Cole and I discussed some options for me to talk about, and the idea was to give a broad perspective of a current issue in wildlife ecology and management. And I'm actively involved in a lot of wild pig issues, and so even though pigs aren't kind of at the forefront of management issues in Utah per se, it's a real major issue globally. And so I wanted to take a little time to talk about the history of kind of how we got in this mess that we find ourselves in with pigs, what we're doing about it in terms of management, and where do we go from here. And so as a species, wild boar evolved several million years ago in Southeast Asia, kind of diverged into a variety of subspecies in Asia and in Europe. And several thousand years ago, this is obviously the species that we domesticated and turned into what we now know as bacon and ham and all those other things. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of attributes of pigs that have kind of created their global distribution. And one of those is, it's a real compact source of protein. Pigs have a real kind of gentle disposition in a lot of cases. And so they're a really unique species from that perspective. And because of that, people began moving pigs all over the globe. And so today, pigs are the most globally distributed, large invasive mammal. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. But what I wanted to highlight here in their native range that you can see in black there is that, pigs evolved from the tropics of Southeast Asia to the deserts of North Africa to parts of northern Russia where it gets incredibly cold. So as a species, they're kind of genetically programmed to be adapted to a wide variety of different ecosystems. So here in North America, in the United States, pigs were, as I mentioned, explorers were bringing pigs all over the world as a food source. They brought pigs to the New World several hundred years ago, to the Hawaiian archipelago, Greenland, and then ultimately to the Caribbean, which is kind of the route that led to our pig issues that we have here. And there were a whole variety of different explorers that brought pigs from the Caribbean into what is now the United States in the early 1500s. So pigs have been around North America for quite some period of time. However, when pigs were brought here, we didn't have the livestock confinement situations that we typically have today. Back then, what people did was notch the ears of their pigs. They turned them loose on the landscape, and whenever they wanted a pig to eat, or go salt down, they would go and harvest an animal for to feed their families. And so pigs were private property. They weren't a huntable animal. We weren't really thinking about damage or recreational harvesting of that point. This was simply just a subsistence issue. And because of these practices, though, pigs started to slowly seed the landscape. These animals became feral. And think of it as planting the seeds of the problem that we have today. These domestic animals slowly began to infiltrate, and as you can see, by the 1800s, were found in a really large number of states. Well, fast forward a little bit to the late 1800s. This is, remember, think back to what you've learned about what we did to wildlife in North America in the 1800s. We were decimating bison and passenger pigeons and things like that. Well, we began bringing wild boar over as a huntable game species as well. And wild boar were initially, these are purebred boar, initially introduced into game reserves. So these are fenced enclosures in a variety of different places of the United States that you can see here highlighted on the map. And many of these served as subsequent relocation efforts where they took pigs from these fenced operations and moved them all over. And kind of the most famous one is the Hooper Bald facility in North America, or in North Carolina. And you can see that pigs from Hooper Bald were moved all over the southern United States and even out to California. And unfortunately, pigs are really clever, and in most all of these facilities, pigs got out and began moving around the landscape and establishing populations. So remember, we had an established feral population of pigs throughout many states at this time. And so these wild boar began to move out in the landscape as well. And it created a situation where these pigs began breeding with one another. And so here we have purebred Eurasian boar that still have a lot of that genetic makeup that makes them really hardy and adaptable to a variety of situations. And on top of that, we have these domestic animals that have fertilized, that we've kind of been programming for many years to kind of maximize reproduction. And so feral pigs and wild boar have differing numbers of piglets and things of that nature. And so basically these animals started breeding with one another. And what we have today is something that looks like this. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is a study by the National Wildlife Research Center where we're looking at the proportion of genes that are from Western heritage breeds, which are domestic pigs, commercial breeds of domestic pigs, and European wild boar. And you can see that almost 100% of the pigs that we have on the landscape in the United States today have some introgression of wild boar and domestic genes. And depending on where you are in the landscape, the proportion of wild boar versus heritage and commercial breeds tends to differ. And it all depends on what that history looked like in terms of the introduction. You can see certain parts of the Northeast and kind of North Central US, there tends to be more wild boar genes in the genome. On the left, those are some data from the Savannah River site, which is where I do a lot of my work in South Carolina. And each one of those vertical blue bars represents an individual with a proportion of wild boar genes among those that were analyzed. And what you can see is that 100% of the pigs that we've surveyed to date have some wild boar and domestic introgression of genes, with the majority of individuals having about 25% wild boar associations. but individuals ranging from anywhere from 5 to 10% all the way and up to 60%. And so this composition tends to vary depending on where you are in the range. But the broader point that I want to make is that, for the most part, pigs across the US are this real unique mixture of these varieties of domestic pigs, heritage pigs, and European wild boar at this point. And so these animals continued to reproduce on the landscape, continued to slowly expand. They really weren't a major issue for many years. And some things started to change in the 50s that started to change the culture of pig management, the culture of pig hunting, and ultimately the trajectory of where we are today with pigs. And so a number of states at this time actively began considering pigs a huntable big game species, began calling them a big game species. And it's kind of inconceivable at this point, but a number of states actually began active stocking programs where they were taking pigs and moving them into areas to establish, huntable populations. And what this did was it really started to establish a culture of pig hunting and an excitement and interest in pig hunting that now exists in many states. And today they're the second most harvested big game animal. And there's even a few states where they still maintain a game status, but we'll talk about that a little on in the talk. And so, as there was more and more interest in pig hunting, things began to change even more. But in the 90s, that's when things really changed with pigs. And you can see across these figures, there's a variety of publications that have highlighted this, but pig populations just exploded in the late 1990s. And you can see that both in number and in distribution. And if you look at the figure from the McClure et al. Paper, you can see that there's also kind of a patchwork of pig populations that's kind of moving out throughout the landscape. And we'll talk about that here on the next slide. And so this wasn't just an issue in the United States. This is the same pattern repeating itself in Australia. We're also seeing expansion of populations in their native range and throughout other parts of their invasive range. And so a lot of people like to think of this as the pig bomb. So in the 90s, the pig bomb went off and pigs just absolutely expanded and exploded throughout many parts of the country where they either didn't exist or they were in low abundance. And so there's a lot of reasons why we think this happened. There's certainly natural range expansion. As populations increase, they continue to expand through time. There's also some evidence that climate change played a role, especially in their native range in terms of expansion due to the changes in agricultural practices. But one of the things that's been identified here in the United States anyways as a major contributor, especially to that patchwork of emerging populations that you see is escapes from game farms like we had originally with wild boar, but more importantly, the illegal translocation of pigs. So if you think about it, pigs are really one of the ultimate game species. You can hunt them year round. They taste really good. You can hunt them at night in many states. You can kill as many as you want. And so, a lot of people are interested in hunting pigs. They're a really desirable species from that perspective. And so what happened was people began catching pigs in places where they're abundant, putting them in livestock trailers and moving them and letting them go in landscapes where there either were few pigs or hardly or no pigs at all, and establishing new huntable populations in their area. And this is compounded by the fact that it's really difficult to track these illegal activities down and enforce them. And I've got a slide on this a little bit more later. And so we've actually been doing some work in my lab to try and look at the spatial ecology of translocated pigs. And these are pigs that are moved to areas that still have pigs. And we wouldn't want to be establishing new populations anywhere, but we're looking at the movement trajectories of animals following these translocations and finding some really incredible things. So you can see from this figure here, these are some preliminary data. These animals, when we turn them loose on the landscape, are making these massive movements around the landscape, typically seem to be exhibiting some homing behavior. But when you look at an overall home range, a lot of these animals have home ranges in that first 30 days after translocation that are about 50 to 100 square kilometers. So these animals are making these massive movements. And on top of that, almost all the pigs that we've been tracking have integrated within a new social group within 1 to 2 months. And so they're highly effective at finding other animals, and they're highly effective at covering substantial amounts of ground. So it's not too hard to imagine how new populations could emerge just by 1 or 2 translocation events. And so one of the things that started to happen as pigs began to expand is more and more people became impacted by pigs. So many of you probably are aware, but pigs cause an incredible amount of economic and environmental damage. They're one of the most destructive invasive vertebrates that we have here in North America. A lot of times we think of pig damage when we think of agriculture. Pigs cause damage to a variety of crops. Down here in the Southeast, there are a number of farmers who just simply stop planting corn in certain fields because the pigs will eat it all every year, even if they plant it 2 or 3 times. And so they cause a considerable amount of damage to crops, but they also cause damage to property. Just outside the window here, about once a year, they come in over 1 or 2 nights and turn up all the soil in front of the office building here, and it takes weeks to go in and repair that. So it's not just a rural issue, it also can be an urban issue. Another issue that's kind of increasing in prevalence is vehicle collisions, or at least awareness of vehicle collisions. Here on the Savannah River site where I work, there are about as many pig vehicle collisions a year as there are deer vehicle collisions. This is something that's gained a lot of attention over in Europe, something we're kind of a little behind the curve in paying attention to, but pig vehicle collisions are certainly a growing issue as these populations expand. One of the things that we have far fewer data on that is probably equally, if not more significant, is some of their environmental impacts. So as I've kind of alluded to, and many of you who are aware of pig issues know, pigs overturn the soil when they're foraging, called rooting. And what this does is kind of upturns the soil, can create some erosion issues, can alter the density of soil, the pH of the soil, can cause all kinds of soil level impacts. And the ultimate implications of that are not fully known for a lot of species, but obviously there are likely impacts there, and some of the there's a number of researchers out there right now that are looking at impacts to both native species by pigs and through threatened and imperiled species. And in my lab, one of the ways that we're looking at this is through some dietary analyses. And again, these are some preliminary data that we're working on at the moment, looking at the composition of vertebrates in pig diets. And just from a small sample of individuals, you can see that they're consuming a whole variety of different species, but particularly a variety of different frogs, so some reptiles and amphibians potentially being impacted here. And so, we've got a number of research projects right now that are trying to expand on this to really better understand what those broader impacts to these species are. But really the elephant in the room, or pig in the room, if you will, when it comes to pigs is disease. Pigs carry a whole suite of different parasites and diseases that affect humans, that affect pets, that affect native wildlife like the Florida panther. But the real big one that we often talk about are foreign animal diseases. So if any of you have followed any of the news on classical swine fever or African swine fever in Asia or parts of Eastern Europe or even Africa, none of that news is good. That's resulting in the slaughter of millions and millions of domestic animals. It's causing the complete shutdown of export markets of pigs, of pork for a lot of these countries. So it's having a pretty devastating economic impact as well. And so we're really fortunate in the United States that we don't have either of these diseases at the moment, but this is obviously one of those major concerns that if one of these diseases got into our wild population and somehow got into our domestic herds, that could be economically devastating. And so as populations continued to increase throughout the 90s and early 2000s, as these impacts started to become more and more apparent, more and more people were impacted by pigs, we had what I often refer to as kind of a turning of the tides. There's been a slowly evolving shift in the perception of pigs on the landscape, and whether or not they're a species that we're comfortable living with, or one that we want to take a much more aggressive approach at removing. And as we've kind of been going through this phase of increased management of pigs, there's been, some states that have taken really aggressive action. So New York State, for example, completely banned all pig hunting as part of their eradication effort to try and remove any incentives for people to have pigs on the landscape. And there's some other states that are taking some similar approaches, or at least having discussions of similar approaches. But the other state that I think is probably taking the most aggressive action is Missouri, where they've banned pig hunting on their conservation lands, but they've also developed a really elaborate collaborative solution to trying to really reduce the pig population in that state. And so we have certain areas, certain states, certain agencies starting to take a much more proactive approach, kind of beginning in the mid 2000s here. And really by the 2010s, that's when things really started to take off in terms of changing the tides, changing the perception of pigs on the landscape. And two of the things that I think have been some of the biggest catalysts for this are in 2014, the creation of the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program. So this is a program that is led by USDA APHIS. And so basically impacts got to the point where Congress allocated money to develop this program. And a lot of the program is focused on control of pigs to reduce damage, but there's also components that focus on research, disease monitoring, development of new tools to control pigs, and importantly, communication and outreach as well. And so here we have, to my knowledge, the most extensive nationally coordinated campaign to remove or reduce populations of an invasive species. I can't think of another species where there's such a coordinated national program and investment of resources at that kind of coordinated level as we have now with pigs. And that's only grown over the last several years. Around the same time, we had the creation of the National Wild Pig Task Force, which some of you may be familiar with, which brings together a whole group of different stakeholders to provide a technical, scientific, and leadership alliance. And so really, this group plays a really important role in being advocates for control of wild pigs in the United States. And so we've seen this pretty substantial shift in terms of the resources that are available to control pigs, and starting to see this shift in the perception of pigs on the landscape compared to where we're at, even 10 or 20 years ago. But that doesn't mean that we don't have some major challenges. And this is one of the major challenges that remains when we talk about pigs. And that's, we have really polarized views. So we've been cultivating this interest in pigs as a game species. Agencies have been cultivating this interest for decades. And now we have enough people being negatively impacted, whether it be economically or by other means, by pigs, where there's a large number of stakeholders who now have kind of changed their perception of pigs on the landscape. And this is something that's not going to go away overnight. And on top of that, we still have a handful of states that treat pigs as a game species, whereas, as I just mentioned, we have other species that have completely outlawed the hunting of pigs. And so we've got these very different approaches to managing pigs. On top of that, like with anything that grows legs like this, there's a whole cottage industry that's grown up around pigs, a new widget, a new gadget to control pigs, to trap pigs, land leasing, all those kind of things. But two of the biggest ones, or one of the biggest ones from my perspective, is that we have a couple of states, Texas and Florida, where you can actually go out and live trap pigs and sell those pigs for profit. And so, even here in the local grocery store, I can go and for a very premium price buy wild boar meat at the deli. And if you read the fine print in it, it says wild boar meat and then from Texas. And so there's an intensive marketing campaign for the harvesting of pigs and the sale of meat. And so anytime you have economic interest on both sides, these are challenging problems to navigate. On top of that, we kind of let pigs get to the point where they become really widespread and really abundant. And today they're the most widespread and abundant invasive large vertebrate in the U.S. And you can see from this figure here, there's a lot of the U.S. that pigs can live and do live. And that's because, as I mentioned early on in the talk, pigs pigs can live in arid environments, tropical environments, cold environments. We have them up in Saskatchewan. And so they're really a true ecological generalist. They can live about anywhere, eat about anything, and in much of the US have really few effective predators outside of humans. And as a researcher, this is something that I found absolutely fascinating from the first day that I started working on pig issues. This is the second most harvested big game animal we have in North America, yet we have an incredibly poor understanding of their basic ecology. You can see from these publications here that it's only been the last couple decades that we've started to even engage in intensive research on this species. And there's a lot of things that we simply don't have data for. A lot of the ecological impacts are not fully quantified. And part of the problem is, even today, a lot of the emphasis is on removal of pigs from the landscape. It's not advantageous or desirable to be putting collars out on pigs and turning them loose on the landscape. It's a constant balancing act between management of the species and reducing damage and collecting ecological data. And one of the examples that I like to use from this is in terms of survival. And so if you go into the literature and look at survivorship of fawns, of white-tailed deer, of elk, a variety of other game species, you'll find dozens or hundreds of studies that have looked at fawn survival. Wild pigs, there's not a single published study that's quantified with a known fate model survivorship of piglets, neonate pigs. So I've got some students now that are working on this. It's an incredibly challenging undertaking to try and not only get neonate pigs, but nonetheless, these are essential data if we want to develop robust population models, but we just don't have that basic ecological data. And so finally, the last, I guess, major challenge that I'll highlight is that pigs have an incredible reproductive potential. This is a species, again, that many of the descendants, are derived from individuals that were domesticated. And so we've domesticated them and maximized their reproductive potential. And so in the Southeast, pigs can physiologically reproduce at only several months of age and can have 3 litters in 14 to 16 months. And we have sows that we've tracked that have had 3 litters in this time period. On top of that, they have several litters or several piglets per litter, and there's pigs born throughout the year. So this lower figure, if you look at the orange bars, that's data that one of my PhD students is collecting at the moment. You can see that we've got piglets being born in every month of the year. And so it's not like a species that exhibits cyclical reproductive patterns. There are new crops of pigs being dropped on the landscape every month out of the year. So it's just a really challenging species to ever get a hold of. And so there's a lot of challenges when it comes to managing pigs. But as I've hopefully highlighted, we've really started to turn a corner in how we think about this species. We've got some really widespread professional level, national level coordinated management of the species, but obviously some challenges. So in the next part of the talk, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how we manage pigs currently, what some of the advantages and disadvantages to those approaches are, how much management is enough, and then finish off with kind of where we're going with pig management. And so one of the good things when it comes to pigs is that we have a lot of tools at our disposal to control pigs. And the most commonly implemented tool is recreational sport hunting or recreational or casual trapping. And so sport hunting is inexpensive for states to implement. It's legal in the vast majority of states, as I mentioned, and in many states, actually derive, economic resources from the sale of hunting licenses and things like that. However, one of the challenges to recreational hunting is most studies have demonstrated that only reduces the population by about 10 to 30%. And I'll get into this, why that's important, a couple slides from now. And so they're just not having enough impact to reduce the population at any substantial level. And this is one of the reasons why there's been a lot of discussion in certain states where pigs are are really peripheral populations or isolated populations about banning the sport hunting of the species in those states anyways, because it's creating this cultural perception of pigs as a big game resource. So it's kind of perpetuating this interest in hunting pigs. As I mentioned, recreationally, a lot of people trap, a lot of landowners trap pigs. Folks that have a couple hundred acres of cornfields often have traps that they'll put out on the landscape in areas where there are pigs. And what's often done in these situations is, we're just using small box traps like I've got here on the bottom, or simple corral traps. And those are just designed to put a Band-Aid on the problem in most cases. We're trying to get a couple of problematic animals off the landscape or fill the freezer full of some nice game meat. But ultimately what this is doing is, I refer to it as cropping or mowing the grass. We're just kind of skimming the fat off the population each year. We're not having any real impact on population reduction. Now, as I mentioned, there's a national program, but there's a whole variety of different folks out there that are engaged in professional lethal management. There are, private industries that have developed around the lethal management of pigs, professional sharpshooters, aerial gunning operations, professional trappers, a whole variety of different things. And there are some advantages that come with this kind of professional level management. And one, the shooting is much more efficient in terms of the tools and technology that those folks often have access to. But from a national level, really, what's different here is the use of aerial gunning. There is some recreational aerial gunning that you can pay a fee and get up in a helicopter and do. But this is really a technique that USDA has embraced and is using in many parts of the country where you have some open country and you can get out there and remove large numbers of pigs. But like anything else, aerial gunning alone, and I'll talk about this in the next few slides, there's no one tool that's going to remove pigs from an area. You need to throw as many tools as you can at this species. And here's a figure by Kim Pepin's group, and you can see that first pass with the first day that you go out with a helicopter and shoot pigs is by far the most productive day in most cases you're going to have. After that, this is an incredibly intelligent animal, so they adapt, they learn what that helicopter is all about. And so initially there can be some success with this, but again, you need to follow it up with other techniques thereafter. But one of the biggest differences in terms of professional management is trapping. So as I mentioned, the individual landowner is not interested on broad scale reduction in pigs. They're trying to solve a local problem that pertains to them. At a professional level, we're often talking about bigger pieces of property or multiple landowners. And one of the advantages is we can use group-based traps, what we call smart traps. And so these are traps that can be activated by a cell phone or a live wire feed from a computer. And the way that pigs enter traps, if you've never trapped pigs, is the adult dominant sow typically stands outside and the young pigs often go in, and sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes a week, sometimes it takes a month for that last sow to go in there. But when we're talking about professional trapping, we can often wait for that last sow to go in there and not educate the entire social group. And so there's a huge movement in the industry right now towards these smart traps, but they're just simply not affordable to the average landowner. Most of these traps are $4,000 to $6,000 for a single trap, and that's just not practical for most landowners. So in addition to lethal management, there are some non-lethal tools available for pigs, although quite limited. Like anything, there are different gadgets out there, scaring devices and repellents and things like that really are not effective at long-term control. In Europe, where wild boar are a desired game species, they sometimes use supplemental feeding during periods of peak crop availability to try and reduce those damages. But here, really the most effective non-lethal tool that we have is fencing. And this is used at a local scale. I know landowners that will fence off with electric fence certain high value crops. But at a large scale, this is we're not going to fence off entire states and remove pigs. There have been a couple examples where they have fenced off large areas. There's an island where they did this, Pinnacles National Monument. I'll talk about this in a little bit. They fenced that off and did some eradication efforts there. But in reality, fencing is more of a local tool. There's also a lot of interest in contraceptives when we talk about wildlife management. And with pigs, unfortunately, there's no contraceptive registered in the U.S. at the moment, to my knowledge. And there's no pig-specific contraceptive either. There is some work that I'm aware of on a gonadotropin-releasing hormone injection and has shown some promise. But when we're talking about having to actually physically inject the contraceptive into the pig, that's not realistic in terms of widespread pig management. That said, there's been some modeling work that suggests, as you can see here, that if we had a contraceptive and it was fairly widely applied, if you could couple that with intensive management, you could have some major success at reducing populations of pigs. So this is something that, there's obviously a lot of interest in developing, but, to develop a contraceptive is not going to be easy. It's going to take resources and a lot of bright minds to try and work that out. No talk on pigs, I guess, at this point in time would be complete without a slide on toxicants anyways. There's a lot of interest in toxicants, so I figured I'd spend a few minutes talking about them here. Australia has really been at the forefront when we talk about toxicants in pigs. They have different regulations and things of that nature, and they've tried a whole variety of different toxicants. But here in the United States, the two that are actively and most heavily being pursued are a warfarin-based toxicant and a sodium nitrite-based toxicant. So caput is a warfarin-based toxicant that some of you may have heard of. It was registered by the EPA in 2017, and those of you who follow this recognize and remember that there was a huge outcry. A lot of media attention was paid to this. It was about to be rolled out in Texas, and there were some lawsuits that prevented that, and the manufacturer ultimately pulled it from being distributed in Texas until there was some more work done to try and evaluate some of the non-target impacts of warfarin. However, that's still moving forward. There's still active research and efforts to bring a warfarin-based toxicant onto the market. And so we've actually done some work in my lab on warfarin-based toxicants for pigs, where we've been looking at rates of mortality, time to mortality, some of the physiological impacts of the toxicant, because warfarin is a toxicant that takes several days for animals to succumb, whether it's a rat poison you put out or a toxicant for pigs. I don't think a lot of people realize that animals eat the bait and it takes about a week for them to die from that exposure. And so we actually did some work and found that pigs are in fact highly susceptible to warfarin, even at very low dosages or concentrations anyways. But we ran into some major challenges when it came to access of the bait stations and palatability. You can see what this bait looks like in its current formulation, these kind of thick wax blocks. And we just had some real challenges getting pigs to actually consume these blocks in any sort of quantity. And so this is something that's ongoing, I think, with some tweaks to the formulation and bait access issues. I think it's realistic that we're going to see some of these toxicants on the market in the next several years. There's a lot of people who are trying to get some of these things implemented. Same thing with sodium nitrite. This is a toxicant that's a little bit further behind in the approval process. It's probably a couple years anyways from being approved by the EPA. But both of these are moving forward and are potentially going to be on the market at some point. But a couple of points I want to make with toxicants is, there are no toxicants out there that are pig specific, and with any toxicant, there are non-target concerns. And one of the ways around that are these pig specific feeders, but anywhere you have bears, you have some access issues. The feeders that we've been evaluating work really good at excluding non-targets, but they also make it very difficult for pigs to feed out of them as well. And so there's a lot of trade-offs there. And then ultimately, this is a large animal. It's a game animal that people are out there harvesting and eating. And so there's some game meat questions and concerns and some ethical considerations as well. And ultimately, I think it's really critical to stress that toxicants, even if and when there are toxicants available, are not a silver bullet. If you read the headlines in a lot of media outlets, you'll see a lot of language that toxicants are going to solve the pig problem. And I think the reality is that I don't think anybody who is even developing toxicants would argue that toxicants alone are going to solve the pig problem. In fact, with pigs, it'll just become another tool in the toolbox. And pigs, we need as many tools as we possibly can, because it takes a truly integrated approach to control pigs. And one example of this, these are some data from Texas Wildlife Services that Mike Bodenchuk was gracious enough to share with me. This is what their take looks like in terms of the distribution of pigs that are taken over the last couple of years. And you can see that, Texas is, fairly open country in a lot of places. Aerial gunning is a heavy part of their program, and they have a lot of success with that program. But you can see that they also integrate shooting, trapping, snares, and a variety of other things to try and control pigs. And it's truly an integrated approach. And so, that all kind of begs the question as to, how much effort is enough to control populations. I mentioned a few slides back that, you have to remove 10 to 30%, or that sport hunting removes about 10 to 30% of the populations, but that simply doesn't seem to be enough to be controlling populations. Well, there's been some work done out there that suggests that you need to remove 40 to 3/4 of the population just to stabilize the population, let alone result in a declining population trend. And just to highlight that, the graph that you can see there is the number of pigs taken on the Savannah River site here where I'm at year after year over the last almost 2 decades. And you can see that population is just growing and growing and growing. And right now we're close to 2,000 pigs a year being removed. And these pigs are being removed by a contractor program where contractors are paid a bounty. There's also a little bit of federal trapping as well, but most of these are bounty take animals. And you can see that despite this, professional trappers out there trapping, and we can discuss the pros and cons of the bounty system and how it's clearly not working here. But I guess my broader point is, even with this intensive culling effort, it's just not even making a dent in terms of turning the trajectory of this population to even a stable one. And so, in most situations, we're constantly just playing whack-a-mole when it comes to pig populations, even professional management. We go in, this landowner, this property, this national forest is having an issue. Traps are put out, pig populations are reduced. As those populations are reduced, the effort required per pig goes up, and then we move on to the next place. And with pigs, as I've highlighted earlier on, they have such a reproductive capacity that they just repopulate themselves in a matter of months or just a couple of years. And so really most management for pigs is just not reaching this, half to 2/3 of the population reduction. And so we're basically creating short-term reductions in damage, short-term benefits, and often at a local scale. A lot of pig management is not done at a really broad spatial scale, especially here in the Southeast, where many landowners own 10, 50, 100, maybe 300 acres, and you have certain landowners that are pro pig management and certain landowners who are against it. It's really difficult to put these large scale conglomerates of management effort into these private land holdings. And so ultimately, I guess we need to think about, is eradication feasible? And I put this up here and phrase it this way because I hear this term all the time when people are talking about pigs, is that we're moving towards eradicating pigs in the United States. And I think we need to be careful about how we use words like this. And in many cases, eradication is not something we should be talking about at a national scale or even a state level scale in many states, at least at this point in time. Now, on the other hand, for emerging populations or peripheral populations or islands, this is something that I think is realistic, and there's data out there to support that. And even in those situations, eradicating pigs is no minor task. And here's some great studies that I've highlighted here that actually documented some eradication efforts in a couple of places. And so earlier I mentioned Pinnacles National Monument. So this is a place where they actually fenced this facility and went in and eradicated pigs. And what I want to highlight from this figure here is that black line that shows the amount of effort for pigs. And so just think about it for a second. You have a population that's fenced, and it's still almost impossible to get rid of these animals. It takes incredible amount of time. Several years it took them to get rid of these pigs, and the amount of effort per pig, just continuously goes up. San Catalina Island, that figure right below that one really showcases the integrated adaptive management approach that I think is needed when we start talking about these kind of coordinated removal efforts. And so really early on, they were catching most of their pigs by trapping or ground shooting. It's a little difficult to tell, but after the first 6 months or so, they mostly abandoned the trapping and had to shift to dogs to track down the last pigs that were on this island. And again, this is an island that they fenced, just like Pinnacles National Monument. They fenced it off into quadrats and went in to eradicate them. So even when you have all the decks, all the cards stacked in your favor, it can be incredibly difficult to eradicate pigs, even with fenced areas and with all these tools. And kind of the final scale example that I'll highlight is one a little more local to me. These are data from the South Carolina Wildlife Services folks, where they went in on an island down here with a helicopter and used aerial gunning to remove pigs. And you can see they had a huge impact the first year and really knocked the population back. And then by 2018, removed all but one pig. And for the next 2 years, they chased that one last pig around the island. Fortunately, it was the male. Had it been a female, I think this would look a little bit differently. But that last pig evaded them for several months or a couple of years. And so getting those last animals out of an area is really difficult. And these are small scale isolated examples. That said, the current status of pigs is one that is a cause for some optimism, I guess, when we talk about some local eradication. And so since the national program was established, since there's been this kind of shift in interest to really pushing back against the expansion of pigs, there's been a number of states that have actually achieved eradication. You can see there's, I believe 4 states at the moment that officially are considered eradicated. And there's a number of other states that you can see. There are several more that there's no pigs or no detection of pigs, and they're currently in that monitoring state just to confirm eradication. And these will be popping up into that eradication success stories here pretty soon. But we've got a huge swath of the southeastern U.S. and California is kind of the anomaly here, where pigs are really entrenched. I mean, there's millions and millions of pigs in Texas alone. So to think that we're going to get rid of pigs in Texas anytime soon is probably not practical. And so we've had a lot of success with pigs. There's a lot of shifting interest in pigs. And so the last couple of slides, I want to highlight kind of where we're going with pigs in North America and what does this species look like? What are we going to be talking about in the next decade or 2 decades? And nobody has a crystal ball when it comes to pigs. We have no idea what the future will bring, but everything's trending towards the direction of really intensive coordinated control. There's really a substantial national effort to reduce damages from the species and really push back on their populations and push them back into areas where they had a stronghold for centuries and get them out of these areas where these new emerging populations are popping up. And we've seen some good success from that perspective. But on top of this national level interest in pigs, there's a lot of, I guess, what you would call more grassroots interests. To my knowledge, there's over 40 state wild pig working group and task forces. And these are made up of pork board, academia, state agency folks, federal agency folks, conservation organizations, private industry. All these folks are coming together to work on pig issues and create somewhat of a unified voice at a more local scale. And so, to me, this is where a lot of that education outreach is going to come from, is these local stakeholders that are aware of the local issues and are entrenched in the local communities. And so, even though we're seeing a lot of success, I think we're in for a long road when it comes to pigs. And I think one of the most important things we need to keep in mind is having realistic goals and realistic timelines. It doesn't do anybody any good to be saying we're going to eradicate pigs from 40 states by 2025. I think we need to be really realistic in terms of the challenges that pigs face. However, there's a substantial amount of infrastructure involved now and resources. Most states have coordinated pig management, and that seems to be growing by the year. The number of people that are trapping pigs, the amount of expertise that we have in terms of trapping pigs. And so being able to rapidly respond to emerging populations as they come up, I think will be really important to snuffing out this continued movement of pigs on the landscape. However, when we talk about these broader populations in the Southeast where pigs are entrenched on the landscape, there I think is where we need to talk about a long road and really ultimately what our goals and objectives are. And eradication may not be objective. It may not be even on the table, but it's something that is going to differ it's going to differ substantially than states in the kind of central, western, and northeastern U.S. And so that's ultimately what I think is one of the biggest challenges that we face. There are, even in South Carolina here, where pigs are in every single county of the state, many of the counties only have pigs in a specific drainage or maybe a couple of drainages. It's not uncommon to find folks that have no idea that there's wild pigs on the landscape or that they cause that much damage. So, that tells me that even in the Southeast, in places where pigs are entrenched, that we need to do a better job at messaging. And the more people that are aware of some of the issues, the more people are likely to get on board with controlling pigs. And to me, a lot of that starts with having unified goals and messaging. And this is something that, as simple as what we call the species. When I started working on pigs, and you can see it in all the headlines that I've got in these images. I mean, we've got probably a dozen different terms that we use to call this species: feral swine, feral pigs, wild hogs, wild boar. To scientists, that's confusing. To the general public, that's even more confusing. I think we need to be a little more consistent in some of our messaging. And also, one of the things that's happening is as pigs are expanding into more urban areas, they're impacting more people than ever before. And so as these issues continue to play out, I think there's going to be growing support for that. But it all comes down to outreach and education and the role of various stakeholders in disseminating that message. And then finally, the illegal translocation of pigs. This is something that's really challenging. I've talked with law enforcement folks that have seen people standing next to a trap with pigs in a trailer, and there's nothing that they can do about it. It's just something that's almost impossible to track and enforce. A lot of the pigs that we have in a lot of the Southeast look very similar to a pig that would be found on a farm. And so it's almost impossible to distinguish those. And until there's sufficient laws or other infrastructure to curb those problems and enforce those problems, this is something that's going to continue to really be a challenge moving forward. And there's been some fairly progressive action taken by a few states. North Carolina some of you may be familiar, passed a swine identification bill where they require pigs that are being transported to have ear tags and have a pretty hefty violation per pig. There's some other states now that are talking about or are trying to implement some similar legislation. And so these kind of things are gaining some traction at the moment. And as we continue to move forward, I think we'll continue to see a lot more states moving forward with these kind of actions. But, recall back to early on in the talk, this is one of the reasons why pigs have spread so rapidly in this country. And so, I think to really snuff that out, this is something that we need to work on. And then lastly, I'm a little biased. I'm an academic, and so I obviously, I'm very interested in research. But as I highlighted early on, pigs are a species where there's just an incredible amount of space for people to come together and do great research. There's so much that we need to know about pigs to evaluate management and improve management, develop new techniques, develop new tools, evaluate tools. These are all things that as researchers, I think we can make really important contributions to. There has been a really recent surge in publications on pigs. There's a recent book on pigs that just came out this past year. There's a number of research labs that are studying pigs. It is really growing substantially in the last couple of years. But one of the challenges is pigs are this real weird anomaly. They're not a species that many state agencies fund. They kind of fall in this gray area. They're not really a game species. They're not really a non-game species in many states. They're something that a lot of people don't really want to touch. They're a bit of a political hot potato in a lot of areas, and so that's always going to be a challenge. Funding is always a challenge to research, but it's a particularly unique challenge when it comes to wild pigs. And so this is my last slide here. I'll just leave you with a couple of things that I think are action items that, as we move forward, are things that really are important to either sustain or change to continue to make progress. We've made a lot of progress, but we've been promoting pigs as a game species for many decades. I'm an avid hunter. Pigs are one of my favorite species to hunt, and so it's a real challenge to change the culture of pig hunting and encourage people to think of this species more as a destructive invasive species than a popular desirable game animal. And it took decades to establish that. That's not gonna disappear overnight. One of the other big challenges we have is there's no standardized classification of pigs. That I talked about this on a couple of slides back, but even at a state agency level, we have some states that treat them, call them, manage them as a game species. We have other states that want them gone, refer to them as invasive pests. There's just a lot of inconsistency out there. And as long as we have inconsistency, that's going to be a challenge to any kind of national level management and progress. And then finally, one of the reasons why we've had so much success over the last several years is, there's been a huge dump of resources and interest in this problem. A lot more research, a lot more federal management. There's, dollars coming from Congress allocated to control pigs. And, we tend to be very reactive in how we manage a lot of species. And so as populations are reduced, if some of those resources dry up because there are other pressing issues, pigs are so adaptable and prolific that we'll find ourselves in the same situation again. So I think in order to continue to make progress, that's resources and continued outreach, education, and research. I think are really critical to continue to see the progress and expand the progress that we've had. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge, a variety of folks that currently or recently have worked on pig issues in my lab, and also UGA, DOE, and USDA APHIS for supporting some of the pig research that I've been involved in. And with that, hopefully I didn't go over time too much, and I appreciate your attention and be happy to take any questions you have.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Beasley. Great talk. At this time, like to open it up for questions, and I just ask that people type their question into the chat